Brian Kimmel, I'm very happy to welcome you here to the Audio Garden to talk about Blue Skies, Troubled Waters.
Yeah.
And you are the co author of this. Wow, it's sort of a memoir, but it's a historical document. It began as an oral story that was dictated to somebody and written down. And before we do anything else, I'd appreciate it if you could pronounce the name of your co author and your grandmother.
Yeah, that would be good. Martha Walando Lone.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So she was born in America
Yes.
uh, and was actually had to leave
Mhm.
with her father and mother
Mhm.
and went to Indonesia, where her father was from.
Mhm.
And that was because of the pre World War II
Mhm.
deportations that happened.
Mhm.
And then she lived through the Japanese occupation of Indonesia.
Yeah.
But I wanted to start out with the very interesting story of how this book came about before we really get into her telling of that story. Because when I read it, it's so powerful in terms of it sounds like an oral story that was told in many ways. And it's also very informative of the culture there in Indonesia that her family returned to. So maybe you could tell our audience a bit about that journey from her first recounting of the story to this book that I was reading.
Yeah, and I was just going through the documents, and I discovered some other documents that helped me build the context of the story just a couple weeks ago, and so even more context since I worked on this
Uh
published
huh.
version. So the point of the story, as I understand it, as she's sharing it, it's really her return to the United States that allowed her to share the story,
Mm.
because there was so much political turmoil in Indonesia at the time that this story probably wouldn't have been told. It may have been on the banned books list.
Oh, interesting.
So being in the United States allowed her to share the story, and we were sponsored by the Snohomish Methodist Church here in Seattle area, just north of Seattle, through an organization of churches that helped find sponsors for refugee families. So we were one of the first families to be here in 1961 from who were Dutch and Indonesian, because we're kind of a is the one of the first waves of Indonesian refugees, and people usually don't know that side of the story, or that there were refugees from Indonesia. So the story, it as it was first told, so it was a translation. She first scribbled down the notes in Indonesian and then retold it to the Methodist, one of the Methodist Church sponsors, Shirley Curtis from Snohomish, and who was a school teacher and really active in the church and the community, and helped transcribe. So that's who she was transcribing it for. She was compiling the notes for the story and then shared it in English to Shirley Curtis. I think that it. I think that's the question, or like there was more to
Right,
it.
but then but so at that point, was it published at that point?
It was published, yes, and she published it through a vanity press called Vantage Press, and it wasn't treated as a translation. It was treated as a first book copy, so just the memoir with a foreword from Shirley Curtis, and it really spoke to the times. I think how the story was transcribed. Um, So it had a different title, which my grandmother was not fond of. Where Now Is My Garden? So it featured when you read the story, there's a lot about flowers. There's a lot about garden, and that is a theme in my grandmother's life. So, wherever she goes, she plants a garden,
Uh-huh.
and I think it's a beautiful metaphor too for
It
her
is,
life.
although I have to say, I feel like this title, Blue Skies, Troubled Waters, really brings out her very philosophical way of
Yeah,
rendering this story
yeah,
um, in hard, which is definitely a very difficult story to
yeah.
tell.
Yeah, I think that was her title, and my uncle in 2004, my uncle helped edit a version that she put out with this first title, Blue Skies, Troubled Waters, and so it was in his memory that we kept the title in this. Um, we're not calling it a third edition because it was changed. So much was added to the story, and I, as the editor and co-author, I looked through the whole story to
And so, what was your motivation to take that up and make this really new book, I guess?
yeah, it's a new book that I wanted to, one, stick with the message of why Grandma wrote it because she wanted to educate people about the war in the Pacific, and because she's the last of her generation. No one else in her family is around of that generation, and so these stories are disappearing. And not only the stories, but the culture. Like we talk about storytelling, and that is a cultural legacy, a heritage, and a legacy work that is also disappearing because of how things are globalized, how things are
Right.
modernized, so-called modernized. So we lose the ancient ways of doing things that are still relevant today. And
And so, what is the enhancement though that you made with this book? Like, how do you feel like you contributed to that, like broader message getting out and more
yeah,
people reading this, hopefully, than the previous uh, versions of it?
I did two things. One, I uplifted the cultural references that were made of the Minahasan people, including the language. I did a deep dive in researching the languages. About seven languages are used in this text, including the shift of how the Indonesian language has changed since the writing of this book. So that was one of my first contributions, lifting up the cultural. And then we had maps and other context pieces and whole studies that were just now released from the United States government. And that added a whole other dimension that Grandma wrote about, but she didn't have the research backing because it was censored, or not censored, but closed files and things.
Right.
So I added that, and um,
Well, I have to say, it really makes it. The entire book is fascinating on many different levels. And one of the things that made me think of actually, since you mentioned this, of actually preserving a legacy and a culture in this volume, really, I think. And my co host, Tony Robles, previously interviewed the author of Finding St. Malo, which documented, a Filipino immigration to America around New Orleans. And many people of that community thanked him for really documenting the story and the history and giving them sort of a volume that's like a reference to the
mhm,
culture.
mhm,
And I was reminded of that reading this book. I think it really,
mhm,
in the years to come, will probably be a valuable reference for those searching for some of those roots, as well as the wisdom that's in there
mhm,
for really anybody.
mhm,
And so I would like to get to maybe that part of it because They leave America, and when they get there, they're kind of like rock stars because of that, even though they
Yeah.
were actually deported, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but what they get to is this culture that, in many ways, is untouched by, I don't know how to say it, like cynicism or
Hmm.
there's a certain, like, first of all, they were not really prepared for the war that was coming. And so your grandmother and grandfather really actually helped them to prepare for that. And not only that, but the way they spoke to the narrator, who, I guess her American name is Martha, but her
Hmm. Uh,
Indonesian name was Ath. Is it Ath
Ath.
or Oth?
Ath. Hmm.
Oth.
Yeah.
Um,
Ath and Kath.
she, they explain in very direct way, to her and her twin sister that, one day we may not be around and you're going to have to take care of yourself.
Yeah.
And they go from there. And yet there's this way of overcoming to be joyous in the midst of all of this tragedy that's happening around them. And I think that's a very powerful message of this book that, like you said, you sort of brought, maybe you amplified that a
Hmm.
little more with explaining a bit of the Minahasan
Hmm.
culture.
Hmm. Hmm.
Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Which part? The we
I'm
talked
sorry, maybe I rambled a little bit there. I think
the
there's a message in there for people today who are
sure.
anxious about war, who are
Yeah.
looking at what's going on in, Palestine and other
Yeah.
parts of the world, and they're
Sure.
feeling the angst of this
Sure.
terrible tragedy that happens all around us and was happening around Oth in the setting that she's described as well. And yet there's this wisdom in there that she keeps, that she repeats, that many of the elders all talk to her about what's happening. And that's really what I was trying to get at.
Yeah, and there's that term gotong royong, which I use the Minahasan word mapalus, and it means mutual aid. And so that was one of the through lines, the legacy work that I did to kind of do the background research on mapalus and gotong royong, which is a practice. It's a way of life, and I think through war and through harrowing times, it's how we help each other, how we are present for each other, and not only humans, but like the animals, and we hear grandma talking to the birds and the flowers, and there's this miraculous nature that is all around her, because she's like they go from the village into the jungles, and
Mm-hmm.
that's and she finds the peace even amidst war in the jungle, because the jungle's like doing its thing, and the ecology of this lush place uh, that really tells the dichotomy between the human world and the natural world. And she actually says that quite often through the book, and pointing out that here's this human world that's at in a terrible state, and then you go into the jungle, it's overgrown, that it's lush, and it's constantly providing and going through the seasons, and she feels so at calm and peace amidst war. So to me, that is I think that's a I don't know what you call it. I don't know. It's not necessarily cultural, but I got the sense too that there's something cultural about it, because Minahasan's value of working with nature and indigenous practices that are closer to nature sometimes, the food, and that represents this symbiotic relationship with life, and that we're not at war with each other, even though Minahasans are somewhat of a warrior class, but there's a story behind that as well.
Well, maybe this is a good spot to hear a little bit from the book, if you don't mind reading a little bit to us.
Yeah, I picked a jungle scene because those are my favorite parts. Um, so I'll read from 17, page 17, Bab Tujuh Belas. So Bab is chapter in Indonesian. If people didn't figure that out, because I actually didn't write the translation, but
I actually did wonder about that, so
yeah,
thank you.
it's chapter.
Okay.
And actually, the reason why I put that is one for second and third generation like myself learning the language, they'll be able to see it right in the book.
That it repeats, yeah.
Yeah, and they'll be able to learn to count. And then I recently, not to, this is kind of a tangent, but
It's
I brought
okay.
I brought this book into our local Indonesian market, and someone could point to and see the language that they're familiar with in print. And it made
Mm-hmm.
such a, and do they see Minahasa? If you're from Minahasa and you see Minahasa, it's like, oh my gosh, that's our people are in print.
Right.
It means something to someone who has that culture heritage, but also if anybody could learn it too. So I'm just sharing that it's Bub's chapter, so you get to learn how to say chapter and this. So I'll read from this.
Well, let's start with the chapter name then in Indonesia so we can
Okay.
all hear it.
Yep. Chapter 17, Bab Tujuh Belas. When the first gleam of the sun spread its fingers through the palm trees again, we stopped. A few men disappeared into the jungle to search for wild fruit, while others loosened the cows and horses from the wagons, letting them graze on the sides of the road. The children played noisily for a while and then swarmed between the groups, moving incessantly. Babies cried and were instantly silenced with the breast. I searched for a spot to watch the sunrise, and I sat myself down on a big rock covered with green moss, away from the people. I wished I could have seen a glimpse of the kampungs. Kampungs is village. The kampungs we had left behind us. The tall coconut trunks and huge trees formed a thick wall between us. The nearest palm sprawled outwards, hanging over the wet soil covered with bird footprints, worm marks, and the whorled arabesques of moving mountain shells. Here and there a thick litter of palm trash lay. As I looked up, a pair of delicate bluebirds were claiming their aerial surroundings. Then they swept out to meet me, lifted upwards in mock fright, swirled through the palm leaves, and came down again, their wings silent as a butterfly. Amused, I looked at them, and for the first time in many months I was happy, and enjoyed being by myself. It seemed that I had escaped from man's world. I did not attempt to join the others, and was not aware of the time. This brief moment was mine alone. I forgot that beyond the mountains covered with coconut trees, thick jungle plants, and wild fruit was someone waiting for me. I had discovered a new world, an innocent world untouched by human hands. After a long time I saw a light between the tree trunks and the blue clear sky. This world was different, so different from other worlds that I knew. Even the air was different, fresh and sweet jungle air. I could have sat there forever. The sound of dripping water attracted my attention. I walked towards the sound and discovered a little water stream behind the rocks. The continual pattern of little ripples and eddies and small bright patches of foam on the sides made it more beautiful than ever. Big drops of water dripped from a huge rock above the stream, as if they had been drained right out of the rock. For a moment I stood still. Never in my life had I seen anything compared to the wonder and beauty of the jungle. Then I splashed my muddy hands in the clear, cool water and bent down for a drink to soothe my dry throat. The cool water that touched my face brought me back to reality. Then I heard someone calling for me. I walked toward the road and for a moment stood still at the edge of the shadow. Once again I looked back to the little new world I had just discovered. "I'll be back," I whispered. The bluebirds flew above me perfectly silent, watching me with their little black eyes. As I slowly moved away from the shadow of the coconut trees, the birds disappeared as if afraid to come out into the naked sun. The wind moved the palm leaves gracefully as if they were waving goodbye. A sudden feeling of emptiness came over me, and I wept softly. Back on the road, I looked around in hopes of memorizing the spot. The old man, who was watching me carefully, walked towards a coconut tree in the direction from which I came, and with his parang knife, carved a mark on it. There, he said, "Look at me as if he could read my mind. You'll always find this spot, and whatever you discover in there will stay. It's a good thing you showed up. We almost forgot you," he said, teasing me, pretending he didn't see the tears in my eyes. "Come on, Oth. Your papa has your breakfast for you." Golden yellow bananas and papayas formed our breakfast that disappeared as fast as a log down a waterfall.
Wow.
Yeah.
I wouldn't mind being there right now.
I know. I know. I want some fresh papaya.
That would be wonderful. I, you know, this book is full of extraordinary descriptions like that. And I think your grandmother, Martha, was an extraordinary woman. Just her character somehow, when a lot of times you think when you see a story about a twin that it's going to be a story about twins, and this dynamic between the
Yeah.
twins. But in this, I think really her twin is not to disparage her twin at all, but Martha is a very just an extraordinary young woman in her
Mm.
whole way that in her she's courageous and she tries things, and I think even her father recognized that and respected that in the way that she tells the story. You can kind of read between those lines. Would you like to talk about your grandmother a little bit?
Yeah, she's still around. She's 91.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No.
Oh my
No.
goodness.
No, that's okay. It's well, that was the other thing is that grandma uh she was done she's done with the book. So she lived her life and she's still living her life. It's just that she said it I want you to have the book and to carry it forward.
Mm-hmm.
And so she entrusted me with that. She entrusted me with her story, with our family's story, and I think that's something that I really take heart with because she trained me, my grandparents and my mom. I very much grew up in an extended family and they taught me everything I know about life and they're still there for me in that very present way. And grandma, she was known as a gardener, and I think that's a great metaphor for her because she could put anything in the ground. She said, "I could put anything in the ground, even a twig, and it'll grow and blossom if it's a flower." The only thing she doesn't do quite well with is indoor plants and fruit trees, but she can still manage it. Um, but anyways, she is an extraordinary person. She's very energetic, although she's slowed down now in her 90s. Finally, I think she's slowing down. Her body's quite slowing down too, so she doesn't get out as much as she used to, and she's not as she used to sing quite a lot too. So I got my vocal cords from her too as a singer, and I wrote a little bit about that in the book. And she was really her twin and her couldn't have been more different. They were at complete opposite, like in many ways. and but they were still close at heart because she
Mm-hmm.
always said that growing up as a twin, I always knew what was going on in her life. She could, like, I don't know,
She
feel, or
could feel it.
there's
I've
that
heard
thing.
that before
Yeah.
from twins.
Yeah, and her twin, Kat, Ankat, we call her Tata Kat. She passed away a couple years ago, and that was really hard for Grandma because of being a twin. Even though they lived apart and they didn't really talk as much, and they didn't see each other as much. She's still a twin, and
Right,
that
right.
meant something to her.
I'm
And in
sure.
this, yeah, in this story of being separated from her sister, they were always climbing trees together and always laughing and teasing each other, and and paying attention to the differences between them. But I could see the love,
Mm.
and Grandma really embodies that.
I
Um,
think if there's like one word I would have to use to describe this book, it would be love.
of
It
course,
kind of oozes out of the pages. And I think for those of us in modern times who are feeling anxiety and stress about what's going on in the world, there's a lot of words of wisdom in this book
yeah,
for people to just try to appreciate each day and
yep,
take it
for
as a
sure,
gift.
for sure.
Um, I, I want to finish up. I so appreciate your time
Yeah,
with a few quick questions.
yeah.
One is that you, I noticed in your bio, are authorized to teach by Thich Nhat Hanh. Maybe you'd
Take
like
that
to
on,
talk
yeah.
for a few minutes about what you do professionally.
Professionally, I have the Brian Kimmel Guidance Center, and so I do many things through that. Is one, helping people share their stories. I think that's one of the parts of being I'm a mental health counselor and a dance movement therapist, and I specialize in narratives, specialize in relationships and multicultural healing. So I teach as well, a form of mindfulness practice that I that incorporates somatic practice, like in the body, and because the body holds a lot of our stories, so figuring out what the language of the body is, and that's really important for me, and particularly people who come from, and I believe everybody comes from a multicultural background. And I always ask,
Mm-hmm.
"What's your culture? What's your what were you? How were you raised?" And there's a family culture, there's a societal culture. So I think that's really important to me, and I'm really fascinated by that. So when I usually give talks, I sing a lot, like the start of this book is actually a song,
Mm-hmm.
Esa Mokan, a traditional Minahasan song, and I think that fits with my family lineage too, because we were artists, we were artisans, we were craftspeople, we were singers, we were musicians, writers. So I come from a very creative family, and that's what I do with other people who come into the office, or people who I'm teaching a course or a workshop or a seminar. They're gonna hear me sing. They're gonna be maybe singing themselves, probably, even if they don't feel like you have a voice. I say sing louder, and dancing. I think these are all, to me, they're legacy works, because
Uh-huh.
every culture has a song, every culture has a dance, and I sometimes we forget that.
Well, I
And
can see the continuum from your grandmother to you. And how can people communicate with you about this book? How can
yeah.
they acquire this book, Blue Skies, Troubled Waters?
The best place is my landing page, briankimmel.com, and where you'll find all the updates, and the website is continually under construction, but you can get all the information. It's on bookshop.org. I really want to promote indie bookshops, and I just discovered bookshop.org. Not only does it give a discount on the book, but you can also send the money somehow to your
To your
favorite indie
favorite.
bookshop. Yeah,
Yes, yes. And
I love
actually,
that.
we just became affiliates.
Oh,
So
you did?
with bookshop.org, yes.
All
So
right.
thank you for reminding me because I need to put that together and I should give it a little plug, right?
Yeah. You're fabulous.
So thank you for that. And that kind of leads me into my last two questions,
Yep.
which we ask each of our guests, or I do. But let me spell your name for everyone. It's Brian, Brian Kimmel, Kimmel. So
Yep.
he's at briankimmel.com.
Yep.
And Brian, you're in Washington, right?
Yes, Washington State.
What's going on with banning books in Washington, and what's your personal experience with that, and how do you feel about it?
Oh no. I don't
You could be
know.
quick, you could be brief, or you can have a diatribe, whatever suits you.
I don't know what's happening in our around the libraries and whatnot, but I know that there's a lot of advocacy on um, not banning books and having providing information. And I think it's responsibility of families in our communities to you know have responsible information. So I I don't like banning books. I like books, but I think that we need to do better as a society, as a communities, and thinking about what we want our families to have available to us in terms of information.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
And one last question is, if I could put you on the spot and ask you to give me a sentence or two with the phrase "listen and be heard."
Listen and be heard, you are beautiful. Listen and be heard, come home to your true self.
Oh, wow. That was really beautiful. Thank you so much, Brian, for joining me here in the audio garden today. Brian Kimmel, author of Blue Skies, Troubled Waters, along with his grandmother, Martha. And please say her full name for me one more time.
Yeah, Martha Walando Lone.
Thank you so much for
Yeah,
being with us today.
yeah.